In this video, I want to talk about the fastest way I know to destroy your financial future, which of course means that we're going to be talking about buying guitars. I want to talk to you guys about my process when I buy guitars and the strategy I use to get the most value for my money. That way my financial future is not destroyed so much. I want to talk about some of the differences between buying acoustic and electric guitars and what might be right for you, especially if you're just beginning. I also want to share a little bit about how I think of the price brackets of guitars and where I think like the noticeable jumps in value occur. And there's a few other tips that I think can really help out. So let's get into it. Now I want to mention before we get started here that I'm absolutely not sponsored, so everything I say is my own thoughts. Hey guys, Editing Kevin from the future here. As I look back over this video, I want to address the fact that throughout the video I make specific guitar recommendations, and obviously, money is an unavoidable part of this conversation. I get that this can be a sensitive topic, so I just want to reiterate here that I'm not sponsored, and I'm just trying to be honest about what my experience has been buying and owning different guitars. I've gotten questions about gear before, and it occurs to me that this is a relevant and legitimate topic to talk about with my audience. I also get that it can be kind of hard to find an unsponsored source of information on this subject, so in the video I'm going to try my best to be as unbiased as I can. So anyway, I hope this video helps out. Back to on-camera Kevin with his raised eyebrows and bubbly personality. So when I think about buying and owning guitars, there's really like one guiding principle that informs everything else. And that's the idea that the best guitar in the world is the one that makes you play more. So it's not necessarily the most expensive guitar, but it's the guitar that connects most with you. My thinking on this is that if you have a guitar that is really great to play, and it sounds awesome, and like it's painted in your favorite color, you're just more likely to pick it up. And the flip side of that would be if you have a guitar that's less fun to play and just sort of more unfriendly, you're less likely to play it. So the question is then, how do you find that perfect guitar for you? How do you find something that connects with you? And for me, I start with a couple of basic realities. The first of those for me is the fact that, generally speaking, more money is going to buy you a better guitar. And again, by better, I mean plays better, sounds better, it's just more friendly to you. I'm not saying there aren't exceptions to this, and if you have an inexpensive guitar that you really connect with and you really love, or if you play one in a store or something, go for it. Like I said, if it gets you to play more and it gets you excited about playing, then it's the best guitar in the world for you, and I'm not here to hate on that. So if a more premium guitar is generally better, the question then is, how do we get the most value for our dollar? Now this is going to sound really salesman-y, but for me, I try not to be afraid to spend a little bit more. Now before you click off this video and just think that I'm advocating you make bad financial decisions, hear me out. The way I can be a little more comfortable buying a slightly more expensive guitar is by knowing that guitars, unlike a lot of consumer purchases, actually have really good resale value. They generally hold their value really well, like surprisingly well. Let me give you an example. This guitar I've got here is a Taylor 214. Now this was about $1,200 new. The thing is though, I could sell this for like $800 all day long if I wanted to. Now again, I'm not advocating anybody buy a $1,200 guitar as their first instrument, but I think that that's not as big a risk as you might be thinking. Let me put it like this. When you first start playing guitar, there's really one of two things that could happen. Number one is something I hope doesn't happen, but that's that you buy your guitar and you don't really take to it. It's hard and you don't have the time and it sits in the closet and collects dust. Now, in that scenario, I think most people kind of consider this a loss. They think that the money they spent on the guitar is just gone. But like I mentioned before, you can sell it and recoup a lot of that money. The other thing that could happen, the other path that you could take when you first get your guitar, is that you do play it a lot and you really take to it and it's awesome and guitar is your new hobby, in which case you're probably still going to want to sell your guitar because you're going to want to upgrade at some point. If you're really passionate about it, you're really into it, this is something that you value. Now with the first scenario where you sold the guitar because you never really took to it, I would challenge you to think about what might have happened if you had been able to justify spending a little bit more money. You maybe could have gotten a really quality instrument, and maybe that would have made picking up and playing a little easier for you. It would have reduced some of that friction between you and making music, and you might not have given up on the guitar. And I'm not saying this will definitely happen, but it's worth thinking about. I bring up those two scenarios to show you that resale value is something that we should really be thinking when we're purchasing most guitars that we're ever going to buy. Now, I used the example of a Taylor 214 earlier, and like I said, that guitar was $1,200 new. You could probably sell it for $800. So I normally don't think of that as like a $1,200 risk if I don't like the guitar. I think of it as more of like a $400 risk. And if I had known this when I first started, I might have purchased some guitars differently. So anyway, that's why I say that resale value, moving on from the guitar that you currently have, is really something that beginner and intermediate players should be thinking about. Now, I do understand that sometimes you have a very sentimental guitar or one that's really just, amazing. You spent like a ton of money. It's like a lifetime heirloom piece. in which case you're probably not going to sell it. So obviously this doesn't apply to that. But for like 90% of the guitar purchases that I think most guitar players make, this is something we should be thinking about. Anyway, that brings us along to the next part of the video, which is, what are the differences in buying an acoustic guitar versus an electric guitar, and what might be right for you? Now, one of the questions I get a lot asking about the differences between buying acoustics and electrics is which one is more expensive? The short answer is acoustics, but the long answer is that it's kind of a wash. Now, the reason I initially say acoustics is because if you want to compare the price of like a decent entry-level acoustic to like a decent entry-level electric, the acoustic is generally going to be more expensive. If you think about guitar building and just, cost from a manufacturing perspective, this kind of makes sense. Electric guitars are, bigger pieces of wood. They're kind of simpler in their construction. You can make more of them easier. Whereas with acoustic guitars, we're talking about really thin pieces of wood, and so the tolerances are a lot tighter. There's not as much margin for error on acoustics, and so that drives manufacturing cost up. I got my Fender Telecaster here, and this is just a slab of wood. They can fire up the CNC machine and press out 1,000 of these a day. Whereas if we go back to this acoustic guitar, you got to think about this is an acoustic chamber with like internal bracing and that kind of thing. These are just a lot harder to build. But like I said, the long answer is that acoustics and electrics are kind of a wash. They kind of cost the same. The reason for that is that with an electric, to fully enjoy it, you also have to buy an amplifier. So when you add that cost back in, they're kind of on par with each other. Real quick, another consideration between buying an acoustic versus an electric is electrics can actually be quieter. Now the reason I say that is because unlike an acoustic, you can play an electric unplugged, and it'll sound thin, but you'll be able to hear what you're doing enough to practice. This is important if you got to be really quiet when you're playing guitar, like if you have family in the house or something, or if you're in an apartment and you want to practice late at night, something to think about. So the question is, what kind of guitar should you get? There is an old school of guitar teachers who kind of say that you should always start an acoustic because it's harder to play. And they're right about the fact that it's harder to play. Acoustics generally have higher action, which is the distance of the strings off the fretboard. And they also have higher string tension generally, and that makes them a little bit harder to play. But I actually don't like the piece of advice that you should always start an acoustic. The fact of the matter is, if you're like a metal player, for example, and you only ever have aspirations to play electric guitar, start on an electric and just start having fun more immediately. I would say the same thing for, people who only want to play acoustic. Maybe you're like a bluegrass player or like a singer-songwriter and you don't want to play electric really. In that case, just stick with acoustic. Now, if you're like me and you want to play both, I think you got to figure out, what kind of learner are you? If you're the kind of learner that thrives on getting some quick wins, to be motivated, going from zero to music really quickly, I would probably get an electric because, like I said, those are a little easier to play. But if you're the kind of learner who really does well when you can maybe like delay some gratification in order to become a better player in the absolute sense, then I would really think about getting an acoustic. Okay, so once you got it figured out, what kind of guitar you want, whether it's acoustic or electric, what do I recommend for the different price points, and where do I think the noticeable jumps in quality happen in relation to price? So we'll start with electrics, because like I said, I think of them as a little cheaper to start off. If I had as little as $100 or $200, all the way up to about $500, I'd highly consider getting something made by a company called Squier. Squier is owned by Fender, and they kind of carry the Fender models, so like the Stratocaster, the Telecaster. I think there's a Jazzmaster now that Squier has. And while the Squier guitars aren't blowing anybody's hair back, I think that for the price, they're really good value, and I really haven't seen anything in that range that beats them. Now, if I could get into that $500-$600 territory, I would get one of these, which is a Paul Reed Smith SE Standard 24. In this price category, you're still going to be talking about like foreign built guitars. You're not going to be dealing with American made guitars yet, but I think there's a noticeable step up here between this and some of the lower end stuff. I personally love this guitar, and this gets played in my house a lot. I think the Paul Reed Smith SE, which stands for Student Edition series, is really, really great in this price range. There's also some interesting value plays with Squier and Epiphone, but if it's me for my money, I'm probably going to try to get my hands on a Paul Reed Smith. Now, the next price point where I think there's a big step up is about the $1,500 territory, which I understand is a big jump, but at this point, you start getting into the American-made guitars, like this one from Paul Reed Smith. Now, I'm a big PRS fanboy, so that's why I have two Paul Reed Smiths, but at $1,500, you also get into the American-made stuff by like Fender and some of the lower-end Gibson stuff. There's some quality guitars in this tier. At this price point, I kind of think that there's not really any more compromises that the guitar manufacturers are making. So they might not be like the highest level guitars, these aren't the multi-$1,000 custom shop guitars or vintage instruments instruments or anything like that. But at this price point, I kind of think the manufacturers, they stop having to cut a lot of corners. And they build really good stuff. Like I said, I think there's a noticeable jump at this price category. Now beyond that, if you want to get into like a custom shop guitar or maybe a vintage guitar, I think you have to step up to like the $3,000-$4,000 mark before, for me at least, there's a big noticeable difference. Now, I don't own one of these guitars, but I have played them in stores and that kind of thing. And about at that price point is where I think the jump is. These are the guitars that I think, you're probably going to have for your whole life. You're probably not thinking about selling those guitars. All right, so now what are my recommendations? What are my price categories and quality categories for acoustic guitars? Now, like I said, quality acoustic guitars start at a higher price, I think, than quality electric guitars. So if I had less than about $500 to spend on an acoustic guitar, I would maybe consider waiting and maybe saving up a little bit more to get to that $500 threshold. Now, if you can't, less than $500, I'd probably go with Yamaha. I don't own a Yamaha right now, but I have in the past, and for me, for the money, at under $500, they're not amazing, but they're better than nothing. And I also think they're better than the competition at the sub $500 price point. Now, if I had $500, the exact guitar I would get would be the Taylor GS Mini. My dad has actually owned a couple of these, and I am blown away by them. I just checked at sweetwater.com, and they still start at $500 as of recording this. Talk about a friendly guitar to play. I genuinely love these guitars for any price point. Like I said, they just happen to start at about $500. Now, at about $1,200, we get another step up. Like I mentioned before, this is one of my very favorite guitars. This is a Taylor 214, and it was $1,200 when I bought it. Now, with acoustic guitars, like electric guitars, a sign of quality is being made in America. But with acoustic guitars, materials are also very, very important. And at about this $1,200 price point, you start to breach into the guitars that are made of solid wood. A lot of lower-end acoustic guitars are made of what's called laminate, which is kind of like it's like veneer, or it's like really thin pieces of wood that are glued together and pressed to kind of behave like wood as far as manufacturing goes. But with solid wood guitars, they generally sound way better. And like I said, being built in America generally makes these guitars play pretty good. Now, if I wanted to upgrade from even that, I think the very high end of acoustic guitars happens at about $2,500 to $3,000. Now, the reason that price point represents a really good value to me is because at that price point, you can start to get into the Martin Standard series. This is a Martin 00028, and it is my very favorite guitar out of any guitar I have ever played. I played one of these in a music shop when I was 17 years old, and later that summer I got my first job and washed dishes for 6 months to be able to afford this. There are also some really great guitars from Taylor and a couple other manufacturers at this price point, but for me, nothing beats the Martin Standard series. Those are my recommendations, and that's kind of where I think the price brackets are for guitars, but I encourage you to go and check it out for yourself. Go step into a music store, find something that inspires you. Obviously, I'm a fanboy for the Martin stuff and the PRS guitars, but you should go find out what you're a fanboy for, because it's a lot of fun and you might connect with an instrument that you really love. Now stick around for just a little bit more, because I do have a couple of random tips for buying guitars that don't fit anywhere else in this video, and so I'm just putting them here at the end. The first thing is that big box guitar stores like Guitar Center, Sam Ash, that kind of thing, they have 15% off sales pretty frequently. They happen several times a year, usually around holidays. So if you can wait to make a guitar purchase for a little bit, I would definitely try to buy during one of these sales. 15% can really add up, especially if you're buying like an expensive guitar. The next thing I want to say is that, earlier I mentioned selling our guitars, and guitars have resale value. One of the ways you can really maximize your dollar is by buying used. If you buy a used guitar and you take care of it, that's the key, is you got to take care of it. But if you do, you can probably turn around and sell it in a couple of years for just about what you paid. And your cost of ownership can be really, really low. Usually big box guitar stores as well as local guitar shops have a used section, but online, I really like reverb.com. There's always eBay, but Reverb to me is a really good experience. I really like that website. The next thing I'd consider is buying from small shops. Usually, those shops don't cost any more than the big box stores, and I think it's really great to have a local guitar shop. I think that we should help those local shops out, and it can be really good to build that relationship. Shout out one of my local stores, which is Casino Guitars. If you're in the Southeast, you really got to check them out. That's the shop where I got this guitar, and it was a really, really great experience. So consider buying from a shop. We're almost to the end of the buying tips here, and this one really doesn't fit anywhere else in the video, but the advice is that you shouldn't worry about buying a case if you're not traveling with your guitar quite yet. For some reason, at the beginning of my guitar playing journey, I was real obsessed with like getting a good case, and it was totally unnecessary. Unless you're traveling with your guitar, it's not worth worrying about. And the final tip is about identifying a really great guitar. For me, there's 2 litmus tests that generally hold true for identifying an awesome guitar. One is that it's very light. I literally mean weight here. I'm a weak little baby man with no muscles, so this is particularly important to me, but I always find that guitars that are lighter generally tend to be better over time. In that same vein, guitars that are louder tend to be better over time. Now, don't ask me to explain the science behind those litmus tests, but in general, I find the guitars that are lighter and louder are generally better. So that's it. I hope that I've been able to help you make a better guitar purchase, and I hope that you really liked the video. Thank you for watching.